The Life Sciences DNA podcast is sponsored by Agilicium Labs, a collaborative space where Agilicium works with its clients to co-develop and incubate POCs, products, and solutions. To learn how Agilicium Labs can use the power of its generative AI for life sciences analytics, visit them at labs.agilicium.com. Amar, we've got Kannan Raman on the show today. For audience members who don't know who he is, who is he?
Kannan heads the North America delivery for professional services in healthcare and life sciences practice at Amazon Web Services, or AWS. He has more than 25 years of life science experience and has deep expertise in deploying digital transformation at scale. He's led large and diverse global teams and worked for Fortune 500 companies in both technology and life sciences, including digital, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, IBM, Cognizant, and Hitachi.
And what are you hoping to hear from him today?
Kannan has been working at the intersection of technology and life sciences and has seen close up this transformation to tech bio and how data is transforming the life sciences. So I would like to get his thoughts on this transformation, what information is enabling today, the challenges we're facing, and where we may be heading.
Well, before we begin, I want to remind our audience that if they want to keep up on the latest episodes of Life Sciences DNA, they should hit the subscribe button. If you're enjoying the show, give us a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments section. With that, let's welcome Kannan to the show.
Kannan, thanks for joining us today. Can we talk about the current dynamics in the healthcare industry and specifically how that affects life sciences?
Hey, Amar, I'm happy to be talking to you. When we talk about macro trends in the industry today, and I'm going to call out the common ones, which cuts across all industries, which is inflation and interest rates. Not specific to healthcare, but the situation is the cost of healthcare has gone up, right? And if you look at what has happened, there is some analysis and data to kind of suggest that in the past 10 years, the cost of care, in fact, insurance premiums have actually gone up by about 50% in a 10-year time frame. And that is pretty large and significant, right? And if you also look at how it is poised for 2025, there are estimates in terms of 5 to 7%, right? Somewhere between 5 to 7% is the cost of insurance coverage. This puts a lot of pressure on employers from a healthcare perspective. So that's one macro trend, right? In terms of secular trends, right? And I'm going to be very specific here about the US healthcare system.
Yes.
Right? It is very complex. There are a lot of stakeholders, and the interaction and interfaces between those stakeholders is quite significant. And what that does is, in terms of number of patient touch points and caregiver touch points, that is quite high in terms of the patients managing it through their treatment pathways, right? Now, there is this whole aspect of value-based care, wherein all of us want to ensure that the healthcare ecosystem is able to provide quality care at an affordable cost. Yes. But there is more that can be done in terms of scaling it up, right? So technology is definitely going to play a role in that, right? Now, to talk about tailwinds, and I'm going to be again here specific to life sciences, and it looks very promising actually. Monoclonal antibodies, as an example, development of protein in a lab that can actually bind to a disease protein or a disease cell like cancer cell and control that, right? mRNA, another platform that's available today in terms of messenger molecules basically carrying instructions to enable natural mechanisms of the cell to actually generate the protein needed, right? So that's the other mechanism. And when we talk about gene therapy is another promising area that we are seeing today. Both from a gene therapy, wherein putting a genetic material in the cell to make corrections, and gene editing, right? And recently we've seen CRISPR-Cas9 based treatments getting approved. So the way I kind of tend to look at it is from a macro trend perspective, companies are extensively working on putting platforms out there, right? Investing heavily on these drug platforms. And over a period of time, it is also going to enable companies, rather, pharmaceutical companies, to move towards scale in personalized medicine, which makes this whole thing very exciting. And technology is playing a critical role. Today, there is technology available that actually helps, along with computational biology, data and artificial intelligence, to actually come up with these platforms and enable those platforms, rather.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk now about how this ability to manage the large data sets and technology, and how that's changing life sciences, and the different impact, the different ways it's impacting the industry, and how it may be changing what's possible, right? I mean, you just talked about mRNA, cell, gene therapy. These are new modalities that weren't there a few years ago, right? And so it's a very exciting time. And we've also on these podcasts, we have talked about some of these new modalities that are coming up. So perhaps we can begin with like a high level overview of where do you see the biggest impact from these changes, especially happening in data, AI, technology, on the life sciences?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Amar. Now, if I take a moment, right, to actually talk about data strategy per se, right, and then we will build this around that, right? We all have been talking about data strategy for a while now. In terms of data architectures, data management, data governance, all of that. What's different now from a modern data strategy perspective is how can we actually ensure that data strategy is based on business outcomes. Now, that's a very different way of putting together a data strategy that is directly connected to the business outcomes. Right. Okay. So think of this as having multimodal data sets. How can the multimodal data sets actually come together and integrate in such a fashion so that it can actually impact business outcomes?
So can you give an example of like a business outcome that you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is where I think the whole concept of data as a product and monetizing data comes into play. Right.
Okay.
And I will kind of give you one example of monetizing data. Right? A classic case in drug discovery. Some estimates actually put that if you take the top 10 spend across all pharmaceutical companies in terms of research and development, it is greater than, probably more than $120 billion. And some estimates even project it as over $150 billion. This is an area wherein significant impact can be made leveraging technology and data. Right? Now, if you look at in this particular situation, if you look at a use case, right, from a drug discovery standpoint, imagine lead optimization that can actually be achieved by leveraging genomics data, the power of cloud, because now you have unlimited amount of computing power at affordable cost as you need it, right? Yeah. And then bringing other data sets like molecular data sets, and protein properties, and and all the public research that is available today, bringing all of that together in an integrated fashion and having objectively reduced the time to patents. Right now, that is effectively monetizing the data and ensuring that on one hand, getting a product out there in the market definitely helps patients, and that's the main goal. But it also, reducing the time to patents, leveraging all this, actually also brings in the revenue faster, which is important, right? So
and when you said like lead optimization, so for audience members who may not know lead optimization, you have a lead candidate which is going to be a drug molecule, but so you're trying to optimize it because the first one that you find is not the best, so you're trying to make sure that you're changing that so that it becomes the best, right? And that's what kind of you're talking about. Like if we can make that faster, we can get
yeah,
the drug out faster.
absolutely, absolutely. And some classic examples, in terms of molecular docking and
Hmm.
post predictions. This is a situation wherein you can leverage computational biology along with
Hmm.
AI/ML to determine
Hmm.
how a ligand is actually going to dock or orient itself to the disease protein, and
Yeah.
with a fair level of probability in terms of the success rate of the right kind of docking, right? So
Hmm.
what this
Hmm.
does is you're actually doing a lot of work in silico,
Hmm.
so that you're actually taking thousands or millions of molecules and basically saying molecular structures and basically saying these are the few molecular structures that holds the most promise in terms of protein
Hmm.
binding, which is a very important step in
Yes.
in controlling the disease protein, right? So I think that's one example. There are multiple examples in the discovery space,
Sure. Yeah.
including search and summarization, right? Which is another example wherein, as discovery begins, there is a ton of information that is out there around
Mhm.
a particular therapeutic area or particular set of molecules, which we can use search and summarization, generative AI, to actually bring in those aspects.
Mhm. And so what you're saying is that data strategy now is not something that's like in its own world, but it is now getting tied to these specific business outcomes. And so
Yes.
it's a much more streamlined toward the impact then.
That is correct, because the whole idea being, how do we treat data as a product, right? Now there
Uh-huh.
are there are
Uh-huh.
multiple schools of thoughts here, at least two schools of thoughts, and tend to take the hybrid approach, and I'll explain that in a moment, right? On one hand, when you look at the pharma value chain, right,
Mhm.
one might argue that each of the parts of the value chain, like discovery, clinical, manufacturing, supply chain, commercial, each
Yeah.
one of them have those nuances, and maybe there is a thought process in there that it needs to be treated with those nuances, right? And the
Okay.
data needs to be owned. The other way of looking at it is, can all the data be brought together in a very centralized manner and managed and
Okay.
governed in a centralized manner?
Yeah.
Now, there are companies that actually are doing that, centralizing the data so that you have a central governance structure, a central set of tools, and makes lives
Mhm.
easier in terms of integrating those data sets. But
Mhm.
it is not always possible. But what we can do here is, we can ensure that even if data may be sitting in certain silos and need to be treated
Mhm.
with certain nuances, you could
Mhm.
have a common data strategy. You could have a common data governance, and you can also
Yeah.
use a common set of tools to the extent possible, and be able to actually interconnect data sets that are needed to be interconnected. Like, for example,
Mhm.
in the pharma commercial space, right, when the product is in market, understanding real world evidence, right?
Mhm.
But the real world evidence information might also be useful for folks sitting in the clinical space. So
Mhm.
there must be an
Absolutely.
element of data integration that needs to happen. So
Yeah.
I would say that, if we are able to centralize data and connect it in one central place, that is good.
Mhm.
But that's
Mhm.
not the only way. Sometimes we got to take the hybrid approach, of basically saying, even though it may be sitting in various different parts, how can we have a common data governance model, common security model, and have the ability to bring data together on a need basis, right? And that's going to be
Yeah.
critical, tied to the business goals.
Yeah, because see, the way I think about it is that see, on the research side, you have a lot of this omics data, right? Genomics, proteomics data, which is much different from the clinical trial data, which is
Correct.
much different from the sales data that we get, and that's
Yeah.
different from the manufacturing data, right? So
Yeah.
it's hard to have like one common data model for these really very different data sets. But as you're saying, the needs in terms of data governance and data quality are the same everywhere. I mean, it needs to be there, right? So I like this idea that you talk about. It's yes, these are different data sets, but then we need to have like the common data governance model
Right.
that should be coming across.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're right on the mark, and that's I think critical. Uh, and again, I would re-emphasize the fact that from a modern data strategy perspective, it has to be grounded on business outcomes. Right.
Okay. So how are you like seeing now, see data strategy, right? I mean, you've been in the industry for such a long time. Now, in the last, let's say, few years, let's say, or 2 to 3 years, how, like, what are some of these changes that you're seeing? Are you seeing companies putting data, like companies taking this hybrid approach for data, or like, this business outcome, how they're tying that? Like, what are some of the changes that you see these life sciences companies making in the last few years?
Absolutely, it's a great question, Amar. Let me also take a moment to kind of explain what I call as a perfect storm for innovation. Right
Okay.
now, we do have cloud computing. Um,
Hmm.
we have rich data sets. You mentioned about genomics data, multi-omics, basically, all
Yes.
different data sets, omics related data sets. You have EHR, EMR data, and you have so much of publicly available public domain data sets that can be
Hmm.
leveraged for various different purposes, right?
Yes.
So you have that, and then you have the advancement in AI and Gen AI, right? So
Hmm.
when you combine
Yes.
all of this, I call this a perfect storm for creating innovation.
Okay.
And companies are kind of realizing that, right?
Hmm.
And it requires a very sound data strategy
Okay.
to enable that. So it has to be very intentional,
Hmm.
right? In terms of what business outcomes do companies want to achieve in
Hmm.
each and every part of the value chain, and
Hmm.
how does that drive the data strategy of bringing data sets together on
Hmm.
as needed, right? I mean, like you
Okay.
said, not all data sets can be connected, and there may not be a need to connect all the different data sets, but it
Yeah.
is actually understanding that common denominator of data sets that need to be connected and prioritizing that so that the use cases can be built on it and the use cases can ultimately be rolled out,
Hmm.
for actual use.
Okay. Okay. Now, I see. It's easy to connect to business outcome on the commercial side, but when we're talking about on research or development side,
Yeah.
how do people like come up with this? Okay, well, this is the exact business outcome. What are your thoughts? Like, what are some of the ideas that you have, or what have you seen in the industry people doing?
Yeah, so let me take the another use case, right? And again, it is
Okay.
around lead optimization, leveraging Gen
Okay.
AI now, since that's
Okay.
the technology that is pretty prominent right now.
Hmm.
Um, think about how actually we can bring in Gen AI across data sets
Hmm.
and understand the properties that are required to on a to a molecular structure. Right? It is
Hmm.
basically leveraging Gen AI to generate molecular structures that is the best
Yes.
chance of binding to a protein. So it is kind of
Yes.
generating, right? And
Yes.
once that generation happens, you can then again use in silico to go
Hmm.
after molecular data sets and
Hmm.
figure out which ones come very close to the one that the Gen AI has identified, right? So
Uh-huh.
this is actually reverse engineering and reducing the amount of time for lead optimization,
Hmm.
and then basically taking the next step, right? So that
Hmm.
it is very intentional in
Hmm.
terms of what we're trying to do to
Hmm.
enable uh, identifying molecules that has the best promise to go into clinical trials,
Hmm.
right? And when we are
Yeah.
talking about clinical trials, here again, there are many use cases that we can talk about, right?
Hmm.
One is
So,
the
so, so,
digital,
ma- yeah.
yeah, sorry,
So
go ahead.
maybe before we go into clinical trials, right?
Mhm.
Let's think about like what are some of the other use cases, and maybe I can maybe generalize this question a bit more. Is
Yes.
so
Yes.
like so we talk about data now. Of course, now there's Gen AI, which is making a big time kind of entrance in life sciences. And maybe you can talk about the use cases for like both, data, cloud, Gen AI. But before we go into that, how are you seeing the adoption of Gen AI by the life sciences companies? Because yeah, they want to do it, but it's not that easy to do it because of a lot of compliance, and also it's kind of wild west. So, like, what are you seeing right now in the life science industry about the adoption of
Yeah.
Gen AI and how it's going?
Yeah. So there are many use cases, right? I mean,
Yeah,
like you mentioned, on the pharma commercial side, search and summarization and content creation is pretty big,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
it definitely saves a lot of dollars and time
Mhm.
to leverage an AI to create content,
Yeah.
which on the pharma commercial side, because there is, medical review, there is legal review. All of
Yeah,
that can be automated to a large extent, right?
yeah.
But yet,
Hmm.
there might be human intervention required. So it
Hmm.
is, until uh, all confidence is gained that a particular model is actually going to take care of it on its own,
Yes.
there is
Yeah,
always going to be feedback coming in from
yeah,
human intervention,
yeah. And we're
right?
not there yet. But
Yes.
you are you seeing like a lot of these companies jumping into the Gen AI? Um, and like to what extent though? Like, are they just doing maybe just like some point solutions right now, or they are like implementing platforms or so? Like, what are your thoughts there? Like,
Yeah.
where are
So
we?
it starts with point solutions, right? It definitely
Uh-huh.
starts with point solutions, but we're also seeing how those point solutions can actually scale. And
Okay.
also, we have the tools today, right, in terms of
Yes.
retrieval augmented generation, which is bringing in context sensitive information to the large
Yes.
language model so that it can
Hmm.
parse through that and make it and reduce hallucinations, right? So that's
Hmm.
one part of it, right?
Hmm.
We're also seeing multi autonomous agents and
Hmm.
multiple autonomous agents coming together in a workflow,
Hmm.
leveraging technologies like LangGraph, right?
Hmm.
That makes it more, complexity of the use cases can be much more, and it still can
Yes.
actually drive through. So we are starting to see those kind of exciting use cases as well,
Yeah.
wherein the latest technology that is available is getting used.
Yeah.
And we're definitely moving towards productionizing some of these models, right?
Okay.
From a
Yeah.
customer
Yeah.
standpoint, yeah.
And we see, I mean, what I've kind of found very interesting is that the idea of this Gen AI agents that you talked about, right? Generative AI agents. I think that's a concept that came up just a few months ago, and it seems to have taken the industry by storm. Now we're talking about agents everywhere, right? Is that what you're saying now?
Yeah. We're seeing that, right? So, and that is exciting to me because it is able to actually leverage LLMs, but take it to the next level of having a workflow of multiple agents working in tandem, and each of the
Yes.
agent is actually an expert in certain part of that entire value chain, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So there, each of them is doing a specific small task that they're experts in, but then we can bring in the agents together, and then that way we can get some complex activities done, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you start doing complex activities that are kind of human-like,
Hmm.
it definitely gains traction, and it actually solves for a problem.
Hmm.
And we are definitely seeing some of that, right,
Gotcha.
out there.
Gotcha. So now, as we start talking about these use cases, right? And it's irrespective, like data, cloud, technology, Gen AI, where you're seeing those. But maybe let's start with research. So in research, you talked about the one use case, which is developing these new molecules, right? Which probably the most valuable use case you can think of because we can come up with new drugs with that, right? What are some of the other like really kind of impactful use cases that you're seeing in the research area?
Yeah. So I did mention about uh, summary and
Yes,
summarization, search and summarization, right?
yes, yes.
Now, you can actually put conversational AI on top of that, right?
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
the the amount of uh, efficiency that
Hmm.
scientists can actually gain by having some kind of a conversational natural language kind of a method of
Hmm.
parsing through that data,
Hmm.
because it's a trove of information coming from various different places.
Hmm.
That's a very effective use case in terms of leveraging AI and Gen AI and
Hmm.
conversational AI in particular, right?
Okay,
So we're seeing
okay.
seeing that,
Hmm.
and that's some of the, I would say, low hanging fruits.
Yes.
In terms of how we can leverage AI and Gen AI and data
Hmm.
that is available um,
Hmm.
to make life easier um,
Hmm.
for people, right? So that's that's one aspect of it. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Moving to the clinical trials, and I know you started talking about that. So, moving to clinical trials, what are some of the biggest use cases that you see?
Yeah. So there are multiple use cases on the clinical side, right? One example that comes to mind is digital clinical protocol design, right?
Okay.
So it's creating the clinical protocol design for a new clinical trial. How can one leverage all the previous clinical trial designs that have been done and also
Hmm.
results of those trials and bring all that
Hmm.
together, leveraging generative AI to
Hmm.
create a new design protocol? And of
Hmm.
course, it probably does a good percentage of the work. Then there can be human intervention to some extent to
Hmm.
finalize the protocol design.
Sure, sure.
That's one aspect of it.
Okay.
And as we go about it, we also look at other use cases from a patient recruitment standpoint, right? So you
Hmm.
have the EHR, EMR data genomics becoming available,
Hmm.
leveraging all of that and identifying the patient population that can be approached for, say, a clinical trial in terms of patient identification,
Hmm.
reduces the cycle time significantly,
Okay.
right? Uh, we're also seeing examples of patient assistance, right?
Okay.
Conversational chatbots, because I think patient retention is a very important aspect in a clinical trial because
Hmm.
the cost of actually replacing, due to dropouts, replacing a patient in the middle of a clinical
Hmm.
trial is 4 times initial recruitment cost.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so if there is a way in which we can actually do well in terms of retaining patients, and one of the
Hmm.
aspects studies show is how easy one can make it for patients to kind of report back, right?
Okay.
So imagine a personal assistant or a conversational AI wherein they have to respond to their daily questionnaires. They can do it leveraging a voice activated chatbot,
Hmm.
right? In a very simplistic way, getting reminders in terms of their
Hmm.
medication time and all of that.
Hmm.
It kind of eases things for the patients, and uh, you definitely would see a higher retention of patients.
Hmm.
And again, I would relate this back to time to patent, right?
Hmm.
If, right, in terms of how quickly can we get to patents, right? So this way the
Hmm.
revenue starts. Um, so there are multiple, and the other use case that I can talk about is how can we actually generate documentation for regulatory submission, um,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
Leveraging Gen AI.
Yeah.
So those are some of the use cases that come to mind.
Great, great. So I mean, those, I mean, any of those, right? If we can implement those very well, it is going to significantly help with the bringing the time or shrinking the time, right?
Yeah,
For the regulatory submission and drug approval.
yeah.
Yeah. What about on the manufacturing and supply chain side? What are some of the big
Yeah,
impact
manufacturing
cases?
and supply chain, definitely there are use cases, from a golden batch perspective, and from, even some of the traditional industry 4.0 models, right, kind of
Can you
apply.
talk a bit more about that? About
Yeah.
those?
So,
Yeah.
uh, from a standard industry 4.0 model, having, digital twins, for example, could
Hmm.
be
Hmm.
one example wherein, you have a digital twin for a manufacturing plant. Um, that could be one use case. And now, when you look at personalized medicine, um,
Hmm.
and especially you talk about CAR T technologies, right?
Hmm.
Chimeric antigen receptors, T cells,
Yes.
wherein a
Yes.
person's blood is drawn. Here, the manufacturing is very innate, right? I mean, in
Hmm.
terms of drawing a cancer patient's blood and
Hmm.
actually modifying the T cells and putting it
Yes.
back.
Yes.
Now, it requires a lot of process. That manufacturing processes is kind of tailor made for that particular patient at that point in time.
Yes. Yes.
And here's where technology plays a role in terms of providing the right information at the right time in
Hmm.
that entire cycle um,
Sure.
of that process. So
Yes.
those
Yes.
are some that actually come to mind.
Can we go a bit deeper into digital twin? Because I don't we have never talked about digital twin on this podcast. So if you can explain what that is, because first time when someone explained that to me, that was pretty interesting. So it'd be great if you can explain that for
Yeah.
the audience.
Yeah, digital twin essentially is creating a digital equivalent of a system,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Now, it could be a manufacturing system,
Hmm.
and you create a digital blueprint of it that actually
Hmm.
lives by and is
Hmm.
synchronized with the actual system, right?
Hmm.
That is
Yes.
something that you can actually use from a prediction standpoint
Hmm.
in terms of how the how in the future it is going to behave, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Um, and now the exciting thing about this is people are also talking about digital patient twins, right?
Okay.
So with all the variables and all the technology that is available,
Hmm.
how can we bring all that together and have a digital patient twin, right? Now,
Hmm.
this is
Hmm.
actually the next level over,
Okay.
there is exciting times ahead, right? When you
Hmm.
have the digital patient twin, so that you can do even research where, you
Hmm.
can possibly use that for a first parts of a clinical trial, leveraging
Hmm.
digital patient twins.
Okay.
Sounds a little bit like science fiction at this point in time, but technologies are available, and that's what makes this exciting. That over the next few years, we would start seeing actual applications of this from a uh,
Hmm.
uh, drug discovery, clinical trial standpoint.
Yes, yes. That's it's just fascinating. I find it fascinating. So very interested in that area. And now let's also going back to our use cases. What about what are you seeing on the commercial side at this point, or even medical affairs, like whichever you want to cover?
Yeah, from a commercial side, I think it is predominantly around content creation, right?
Okay.
It
Okay.
is definitely around content creation, wherein content that need to be generated for a global company, the same content may have to be translated in various different ways, and
Yes.
each one of them has to go through a country level medical review and a legal
Yes.
review, right?
Yes.
Imagine having a system leveraging AI and Gen AI, um,
Hmm.
taking care of that, at least to a fair degree. And of course, there could be
Hmm.
human interventions required for human feedback. And over a period of
Hmm.
time, the system perfects itself with no hallucinations.
Hmm.
But that's an area where there is tremendous amount of return on investment,
Hmm.
um, right? Uh, and there could be, other areas in terms of how do we use autonomous agents, for example,
Hmm.
from a call center perspective, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
That's the other use case.
Hmm.
And also, can we, companies are also talking about, can we have some kind of a virtual healthcare representative,
Hmm.
wherein, of course, in-person meetings and all of that definitely adds value. But in the
Hmm.
meanwhile, if there is a digital assistant available to
Hmm.
physicians to actually
Yeah.
interact with and get the information they need
Yeah.
on a particular drug, that would be useful as well. And if that is very context sensitive, and
Yes.
also uses concept of multiple autonomous agents coming together, that would
Hmm.
be huge, right, in terms
Yes.
of cost
Absolutely.
savings and for the pharma companies. So those are some of
Absolutely.
the use cases.
Yeah. Yeah. And content creation is both, right? Like creating new content, but also reviewing the content, as you said about with MLR, medical legal regulatory review as well, right? So both creation and review of the content, all of that can now be hopefully done in a much faster and less expensive way, right? As
Absolutely,
we move forward.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there is a lot of interest in capturing and integrating real world evidence, and you referred to that earlier. So, how is that changing drug discovery development process, and what are you seeing like in the industry, and how does it pose its own data challenges?
Right. From a real world evidence standpoint, we know the data sets, right? I mean, there is claims data, there is
Hmm.
EHR data,
Hmm.
there is patient reported outcomes data,
Hmm.
uh, there is patient portal data, caregiver portal data, even
Hmm.
social media to some extent, right?
Hmm.
So there are multiple rich data sets that actually needs a lot of cleansing and
Yeah. Hmm.
integration that is required to actually
Hmm.
leverage it. Um, and what that will actually do, we spoke about value-based care earlier, which
Hmm.
is essentially, how can we get the best outcomes for patients
Hmm.
at an affordable cost?
Mm-hmm.
and with accountable care organizations and outcomes-based payment models,
Mm-hmm.
real-world evidence is definitely getting a lot of prominence, right?
Mm-hmm.
One way to kind of look at it is how can we make this more persona-based, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because this needs to hit scale, and I think real-world evidence is actually going to help
Mm-hmm.
value-based care hit a certain scale,
Mm-hmm.
which will do a lot of good, right? Uh, However, in terms of bringing all of this together, I think a persona-based thought process might definitely help, right? In terms
Mm-hmm.
of because payers are looking at real-world evidence from a standpoint of can they pay by outcomes, right? And can is the
Yes.
outcomes very clear based on real-world evidence?
Yes.
Pharmaceutical companies are looking at it basically saying, uh, in a world wherein if it moves towards a outcomes based payment model, which already is,
Yes.
um, how do I ensure that how does the pharma companies ensure that they have an understanding of the real world outcomes
Mm-hmm.
of a particular drug compared to other drugs that are available in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
standard of care, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's one angle
Mm-hmm.
to it. I also think there is a patient angle to it, which is not getting often spoken about, right? And that's
Okay.
something I feel that can hit scale. So the value of real world evidence from a patient standpoint, in terms of understanding what a patient's treatment and outcome is, right? And helping one understand in terms
Mm-hmm.
of a treatment that a patient may be undergoing, what's the real world outcome of that? Because that actually is a persona that can actually drive scale across real world evidence.
So you mean like patients with like certain that have like certain demographic or like so like comorbidity, like how they are performing? Is that what you're talking about?
It is patients' understanding of the treatment that they may
Okay.
be thinking of getting or they are already getting in terms of what's
Okay.
the real world evidence that that treatment is actually
Yes.
yielding the
What is there?
value.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so that is, because patients can also uh, get more educated about the treatment
Yes.
pathways, right?
Yes.
And with
Yes.
real world evidence data. And I think
Yeah.
that kind of turns things around because
Hmm.
that makes it even more valuable, the real
Yes.
world evidence even more valuable when we have all the different personas actually
Hmm.
leveraging it and using it.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So the see, we talked about the data strategy, but I wanted to go a bit more into in terms of uh, how much of a challenge do companies face with data standardization, interoperability, and how are they addressing it? I mean, it's great to talk about, yes, they should put everything together, have the government, but what are the challenges they face? Like, how are they addressing? Have they been on top of all of this?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Amar, right? I mean, we see all different kind of spectrums out there,
Okay.
right? There are companies born in cloud,
Yeah.
and that's a different spectrum in terms of having the strategy right there on cloud.
Hmm.
But there is a lot of legacy out there, and it is not
Yes.
easy to switch on right away, right?
Okay.
That
Yes.
is where it becomes very important to be very intentional about
Hmm.
what business outcomes that one wants to drive in what area of the value chain, right?
Okay. Okay.
Like somebody might say, for the next couple of years, I want to focus on getting the house in order when it comes to drug discovery, because
Hmm.
pipeline is a challenge and we need to solve for the pipeline challenge, right?
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think then that becomes a very focused mission in terms of understanding the data sets that need to come together to enable
Hmm.
drug discovery, leveraging
Hmm.
computational biology and all the things that we spoke about, right?
Okay.
So that gives a very clear direction, and it is usually top down, and it is business driven, right?
Hmm.
And then that area gets
Hmm.
the focus around it, right?
Yes.
But it is always important to basically, while working on that strategy, have the larger organization in the picture, because
Hmm.
and that's what I see a lot of these companies doing, saying, hey, we focus on this particular area because we want to solve for this, but at the same
Hmm.
time, whatever we actually produce need to be
Hmm.
extendable to the other areas of the value chain, so that
Okay.
then we can get more value out of whatever needs integration can be integrated across the
Okay.
different parts of the value chain, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
So we're seeing a lot of that.
Okay. And in terms of challenges you talked about, there's different types of data sets, but also the legacy is an issue. What are some of the other challenges do you see with the companies trying to put together this
Yeah,
strong data strategy and governance?
yeah. Training is an important thing, right?
Okay.
I think getting and companies are focusing on that,
Okay.
like getting trained to the latest technology. Like I said, we have a perfect storm of innovation. So it is going beyond the data sets that one is normally used to, and looking at
Hmm.
other data sets that are that actually add to possibilities,
Hmm.
and look at it holistically in terms of how it can be integrated with the other data sets, right?
Okay.
So that requires an element of understanding and training, leveraging of technology.
Hmm.
How can we do more and more in silico, right?
Hmm.
That is the other angle to it. Uh,
Okay.
so those are areas wherein companies are definitely spending more time and energy and seeing the
Okay.
results.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. And it's still a spectrum, as you see. Is like there are
It is
some
still a
companies who
spectrum,
have
and
mastered
change
it.
management is
Yeah.
also an important part of it, right? And the
Okay.
initiatives have
Okay.
to be driven from the top down. There is a cultural shift in terms of how data is used. In
Okay.
fact, the whole idea of modern data strategy is actually a cultural shift. It's not data for the sake of data. It is
Yeah.
actually the business outcomes that is actually driving the data strategy.
Sure.
And ultimately, it needs to be co-owned with the business.
Yes. So let me ask you there, like, so it's a cultural shift mainly in like the data and the IT organizations, right? To have like this kind of a data strategy for like with business outcomes and so it's like, how is that going? Like, how do like people who are not used to that, like, how's that happening?
Yeah. Again, like I said, it is top down driven.
Okay.
It is
Okay.
intentional, and that is where
Yes.
it is important to actually say, hey, here is the business outcome that we are trying to achieve, say
Okay.
in this period of time, and
Hmm.
hence what should be our data strategy, what should be our technology strategy, right? So this
Okay.
way, technology and data actually become part of the process, right?
Yes.
And that
Yes.
is where this whole concept of data as a product to actually enable business outcomes comes into play. And
Hmm.
that's the mind shift that I'm talking about. That is a cultural shift that I'm talking about,
Okay.
wherein technologists and business come together and basically become that one team to
Sure.
deliver to outcomes.
Okay. Okay.
Companies that are actually able to do that are the ones that are more successful.
Okay. And as you talked about this data as a product, right? Is there are so see there's the pharma companies where they think about the data product, and then there are the data vendor companies. They talk about
Yeah.
like these data products. I kind of see a bit of difference in that. Like, can you elaborate a bit more about like when the pharma
Yeah.
company says data as a product versus when a vendor company says that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think when I say data as a product, right?
Yeah.
This also goes on. I would also refer to the earlier conversation that we had around data monetization.
Hmm.
So when people think about data monetization, the thing that comes to mind is exactly what you said just now. It's saying you got data suppliers, right? So
Hmm.
for them, they actually collect data, they harness the data and basically serve a product, and then they
Yeah.
monetize it right away. That is
Yes.
one way of monetization. The other way of
Hmm.
monetization is an organization leveraging their internal data sets and even external data sets, bringing it all
Hmm.
together and actually driving a business outcome that brings in revenue, right? Now,
Hmm.
that is the other angle of data monetization, right? I'm talking about
Yes.
this angle of data monetization, wherein then data becomes a product, wherein you're
Hmm.
actually serving that data as a product to a business team,
Hmm.
along with or co-creating it with the business team, and then the business team is actually leveraging it
Hmm.
for reducing time to patent, by reducing the time to discovery by say x number of months,
Hmm.
reducing the time to clinical trials by a period of time, and that
Yes.
translates into revenue. And you always need to have a mechanism to capture that
Hmm.
in terms of what that's saved, because then that becomes a very good feedback mechanism in terms of the level of monetization that this entire combination of data and technology had,
Hmm.
so that it's no longer a cost center. All of
Yes.
this. then becomes a profit center, right? And that's the
Yes.
shift
Yeah.
as well from a
Yeah.
culture standpoint.
And it's very interesting, right? Like as you're talking about, right, is the data monetization. What that is, the definition of that in the pharma industry versus what's in the with the data vendors completely different. Even though we
Completely.
just talk about same terminology, that's really interesting. Now, as you talked about, right? Like so, we now business top down, all of that is involved. How and you did refer to like the return on investment, like reducing the time to patent. How is that actually happening now, right? Like, because like what are like some of these strategies that the data teams or the IT teams are using to say, hey, this is like the dollar value that we're gonna put to what we're doing and for the data side. So what's happening right now around that?
Yeah. So companies are definitely thinking about it, right? Because when such
Okay.
huge investments are being made
Hmm.
in terms of both data sets, harnessing those data sets, and the technology layers on top of it
Hmm.
to deliver to an outcome, there is always measurements. It's not always easy to measure it, but there are ways
Hmm.
to measure it, right? In terms
Hmm.
of uh, how that is actually based on even previous research, right? You always have a baseline to compare against and basically say, now that we have all of this, are we able to
Hmm.
reduce the cycle time? A classic example would be, are we retaining more patients in trial compared to some of the previous
Hmm.
trials because we put
Hmm.
technology out there?
Okay.
Are we creating the clinical trial protocols in a fraction of a time compared to what we were creating before? Hence, start the clinical trial
Yes.
process quickly and put a
Okay.
dollar value to it, assuming
Okay.
that you put a successful drug out in the market after the clinical trials, right? So these are, comparing against certain baseline, not always easy
Okay.
to draw a baseline, but there are always ways to arrive at an approximation of a baseline and compare
Okay.
against that and see whether one is doing better than before, leveraging all of this
So yeah.
technology.
So I like the idea where it's basically for those specific problems, they're defining, okay, well, this is how the metric was and how the metric is going to change rather than
Exactly.
going too big, right? Saying, okay, well, for this
Right.
specific problem, this is
Yeah.
what the value is going to be. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and you talked about this perfect storm. Where do you think all of this is going over the next I'm even like afraid to ask about 5 to 10 years. That just seems like too much of a window. Let me ask, say, maybe over like 2 to 3 years. Where do you think all of this is going?
Uh, uh, we're definitely going to see more data coming our way,
Okay.
right? I
Okay.
mean, from all different kind of data sets, and that's a good thing, right? Because we do have the technology to basically harness it.
Hmm.
We're going to see increased use of AI and Gen AI on top of that
Hmm.
data, and we're going to
Hmm.
see actual business outcomes even more than what we see today, right?
Hmm.
And our use cases are going to become complex, and that's a good
Okay.
thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Because we are
Yes.
actually letting technology handle as much complexity as possible, right?
Hmm.
And that's what I'm expecting will happen in the next 2 to 3 years. I'm extremely optimistic about what's out there. We have
Hmm.
significant tailwinds right now, given all the
Hmm.
different drug platforms that we discussed, enabled
Yes.
by technology and the technology at hand, and where the technology is actually going from here.
Hmm.
I mean, today we are talking about digital patient twins as a which is beginning to happen, but probably when that hits scale, you're
Hmm.
seeing clinical trials that are happening first on digital patients, and
Yes.
then actually going to actual patients, right?
Hmm.
And that also shortens the time to patent, right?
Hmm.
So there are a lot of tailwinds out there,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to pharma company, and very excited about it.
Great. Great. Kundan Raman, Head of Healthcare and Life Sciences Delivery Professional Services for North America for AWS. Kundan, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Amar. It was great talking to you.
Well, Amar, what did you think?
Yeah, it was a fascinating discussion about data strategy, about a lot of the different use cases that we're seeing from data and Gen AI, right, across the value chain. So a lot of the movement that's happening in the life sciences industry. It was good to get an overview of all of that.
One of the things he talked about was this shift in data strategy and how it's becoming based on business outcomes. To someone who is not intimately involved in data strategy, in some ways it was surprising just, you know, to think that it wasn't always based on business outcomes. But can you talk about that shift?
Yeah, it's I mean, so in my professional life, I've seen a few years ago when I first actually developed data strategy, and it was all based on business questions and business outcomes, and that was actually very different from what the companies have been used to. So it was definitely an innovation that which I thought would be it should be obvious, but a lot of times so far the data strategy from the companies have been driven from the data or the IT organizations, which may not be very closely connected to business. But this is a very welcome shift that I find. Spending most of my time as a scientist or in commercial, and then working on data analytics on that, I find that this is a very welcome addition. This is how it should be done, the data strategy, because when you are in a pharma company, all the data or you're doing or all the analytics that you're using, that all needs to be for to answer a specific business question, whether that's on science side or the business side. So it's a very welcome addition.
Kanan also talked about data as a product and monetizing data.
Yeah.
How are data strategies evolving to do that?
Yeah, so with data strategy, when you define different data products, as Kannan explained, it's about what is the outcome you're getting, how you're like moving the needle from where the business outcome was before you use the data versus after that, measuring that. So I still find this is still new for the industry, but I'm just glad that we are getting there at this point. I think you also asked about this cultural shift. So it's a cultural shift, especially for the technology organizations in the companies, and I've seen that firsthand. Coming from the more of the business organizations to look at how that is changing the way people have to think. It has been a significant shift in terms of what how people are now approaching things, and how the tech and business are coming more and more together within a pharma company.
A lot of times we think about the big AI applications that are going to be super transformative. You talked about agents, which are doing these kind of routine daily tasks in a life science setting. You also talked about clinical trials, and one of the cases Kanan talked about was an example of taking the burden off of patients to improve retentions in studies. On the commercial side, he talked about content creation rather than, say, strategy or customization. People want to consider these big and bold AI applications, but there's this ubiquitous transformation going on. Do you think people are missing the depth and breadth of AI in the life sciences today?
Well, see, I think a lot of people talk about many of these use cases, but what I've seen is that when people present, especially Gen AI, as this shiny new object, then they're talking about, okay, well, it is going to change drug discovery or, commercialization, and making these bold statements. The question is how? I mean, it's not like just with one application that it's going to make that change. A lot of people, I think, especially people who are practitioners, like who are working on the ground, they are seeing that there's not just one Gen AI application that is going to change the world. It is going to be a lot of these specific business problems that you have, and there are so many use cases. I mean, in every area there are hundreds of use cases that you can think about, and then Gen AI can specifically solve those use cases. But then the question actually becomes, okay, which of these use cases, of these over 100 use cases, which ones do you want to focus on? Which ones do you want to prioritize on? And that's something where I see companies struggling right now. That's why I kept asking Kannan the question of what are some of the biggest use cases, most impactful use cases you see in the value chain, because that's where the company should focus on. And he also said it all needs to be intentional, right? So intentional in the sense, okay, focus on these are the big high impact use cases. Let's focus on those. But the way I see it is that a lot of times when you read about these the Gen AI, you're reading at like a very high level, like okay, well, high level use cases. But what's going to make a difference is you come down a couple of levels, and this is where the change is going to happen. This is where Gen AI will actually work. This is where you don't necessarily say that it's a magic bullet that's going to save everything. You're working on specific use cases, business problems to solve them. So it becomes very real. It becomes very measurable rather than when you stay at the high level.
The discussion went full circle and came back to the notion of outcomes driving data strategy and this being a cultural shift. Mm-hmm. Do you see evidence of a cultural shift taking place?
Absolutely. I think there is definitely a cultural shift. What I've seen now is both in data and or the tech organizations where there is this it's becoming imperative for them to work with the business teams much more closely to drive the tech strategy. But I've also seen a lot of cultural shift now with the business. By business, I mean the commercial organization or even the scientists or the R&D organizations, where there's a lot more awareness that we need to use a lot of data. We need to use AI to really accelerate whatever we are doing, and that is an awareness. I don't think there was that if I go back even 10 years ago. That awareness is here, and now what I'm seeing is, especially with Gen AI, people are very much aware because everyone has been using a lot of these Gen AI tools, and they are very much keen to see how that can be used in their business aspects as well. So a lot more awareness right now. I think what I'm a bit afraid of, people sometimes just like trying to go for use cases that are not going to be very successful. So I don't think people necessarily have the sense of, okay, well, what is it that's that they can do easily? What is it that they cannot, right? And that's when we also talked about the Gen AI use cases framework that I created, right? That was to address the question. Okay, well, what are the use cases where the Gen AI is much more feasible and is adding a lot of value versus now? I think that's where people do need to spend a lot more time on, instead of just relying on some vendor to just come and do everything for them. So I think there needs to be much more awareness of or like some expertise around these making decisions about what should be the right prioritization.
It was a great discussion, and certainly a lot to think about here. Amar, looking forward to our next one. Until next time.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Agilicium Labs. Life Sciences DNA is a bi-monthly podcast produced by the Levine Media Group with production support from Fullview Media. Be sure to follow us on your preferred podcast platform. Music for this podcast is provided courtesy of the Jonah Levine Collective. We'd love to hear from you. Pop us a note at danny@levinemediagroup.com. For Life Sciences DNA and Dr. Amar Dravid, I'm Daniel Levine. Thanks for joining us.